The day Hazel Archer rode into Coldwater Valley, she had no idea she was riding straight into the one place in the entire New Mexico territory that belonged to a man who did not welcome strangers. And she certainly had no idea that by nightfall she would be staring across a fire at the most quietly devastating pair of brown eyes she had ever seen in her 24 years of living. The year was 1874, and the land was still raw. The West had not yet been tamed, though plenty of men were trying. The Santa Fe Trail had been carrying travelers for 50 years, and the railroads were pushing their iron fingers further and further into the belly of the continent. But out here in the broken mesa country south of Taos, the land still answered to no man's deed and no surveyor's line. It answered only to the seasons, to the dry bite of October wind, and to the occasional crack of rifle fire that meant somebody somewhere had made a decision they could not take back. Hazel had not made a decision so much as she had been pushed into one. She had left Santa Fe 4 days earlier with a hired map that turned out to be wrong, a horse named Biscuit who had the heart of a draft animal and the speed to match, and enough provisions for 3 days if she rationed carefully. She had not rationed carefully. She had been too distracted by the grief that sat on her chest like a stone, the grief she had been carrying since the letter came 3 weeks ago telling her that her older brother, Thomas Archer, had died in a place called Redemption Creek while working a cattle drive for a man named Horace Dunmore. The letter had not explained the circumstances. It had said only that Thomas had died, that his belongings would be held at the post office in the town of Larkspur, and that any family member wishing to claim them should present themselves promptly. She had no one else. Their parents had died of fever 6 years ago. Thomas had been all she had. So Hazel had packed what she could carry, arranged with the widow she had been boarding with in Santa Fe to hold her room, and ridden out with the bad map and the big-hearted horse and the stone of grief, determined to reach Larkspur, collect Thomas's things, and find out exactly how her brother had died, and whether the man responsible for it would ever answer for what he had done. She was not afraid of Horace Dunmore. She had never met him, but she had heard of him the way you heard of thunderstorms in summer. You knew they were coming. You knew they were loud. And you knew that if you were smart and careful, you could sometimes walk right through them and come out the other side still standing. What Hazel had not expected was the canyon. The map, such as it was, showed a clean straight line south from the village of Arroyo Seco that would take her through a pass and down into the valley where Larkspur sat. What the map did not show was that the pass it indicated had been washed out in a flash flood the previous summer and was now nothing more than a rubble-choked gully full of boulders the size of wagons. Hazel had stared at that rubble for a solid 10 minutes before accepting that there was no way through. Biscuit had made his opinion clear by refusing to take a single step closer, planting all 4 enormous feet in the dirt, and twitching his ears in the stubborn way that meant the conversation was over. She had turned south along the ridge instead, reasoning that the land had to open up somewhere. Riders traveled this country. The land was not impassable. She just needed to find the way that everyone else already knew. What she found instead, as the afternoon light turned from gold to copper and the shadows stretched long across the sage flats, was a valley that was not on her map at all. It opened below her like a secret the earth had been keeping. A wide green bowl of land threaded through with a silver creek, sheltered on 3 sides by red rock walls that caught the last of the sun and held it like cupped hands. She could see cattle down there, dark shapes moving slowly through the grass. She could see a barn, a house with smoke rising from the chimney, a corral with horses standing at the fence. It looked like the most settled, peaceful thing she had seen in 4 days of riding through emptiness, and the sight of it made her eyes sting in a way she was not prepared for. She rode down. She did not think carefully about whether she should. She was tired to her bones, her canteen was empty, and the sun was going down fast. In 1874, in the New Mexico territory, you did not sleep in the open on a cold October night if you had any choice at all. You found shelter. You found water. You found the light in someone's window, and you rode toward it, and you hoped that the someone inside it was decent. The trail down into the valley was steep and switchbacked, and Biscuit took it one careful step at a time while Hazel leaned back in the saddle and tried to remember everything Thomas had ever told her about approaching a stranger's property. You called out before you rode in. You kept your hands visible. You did not come in hard and fast like you were running from something, even if you were. She was not running from anything. Not yet. She called out when she was still 100 yards from the barn. "Hello, the house," she said, her voice carrying in the still evening air the way voices did in open country, clear and thin and impossibly fragile. "I am a traveler. I have lost my way. I mean no harm." For a moment nothing happened. Then a figure appeared from around the side of the barn. He was tall, carrying a lantern in one hand and a coil of rope over his shoulder, and he stopped when he saw her and simply looked at her for a moment that stretched long enough to make her throat tight. "You have," he said, not a question. "This is Coldwater Valley. Where were you trying to get to?" "Larkspur," she said. "I had a map that turned out to be wrong." He looked at her steadily, then looked at her horse, taking in the travel-worn state of both with the practiced assessment of a man who knew animals and could read hard miles in a horse's gait and a rider's posture. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy some internal calculation, because he set the lantern down on a fence post and walked toward her without any urgency, not reaching for anything, just walking, his hands loose at his sides. "Come down," he said. "Your horse needs water and so do you." That was how she met Stephen Collier. He was 28 years old, and he had owned the Coldwater Ranch for 3 years, having bought it from an old Mexican rancher named Eduardo Reyes, who had decided at 70 that he was too old to fight the dry years anymore. Stephen had not been too old. He had been 25 and possessed of the particular stubbornness that the New Mexico territory seemed to grow in young men the way other places grew wheat. He had worked the ranch through a dry year and a wet year and another dry year, and it had not beaten him yet, though there had been moments when he had stood in the middle of his own land and felt the enormous, indifferent weight of the sky pressing down on him, and understood exactly why old Eduardo had given up. He did not talk about any of this immediately. He was not the kind of man who talked much at first. He took Biscuit's reins and led the horse to the water trough beside the barn and held the lead rope while Biscuit drank with long, greedy pulls that made the trough ripple and splash. He handed Hazel his canteen without ceremony. She drank from it gratefully, not caring that it tasted of tin and hard water, just grateful for the cool weight of it in her throat. "You are a long way from the Larkspur Road," he said. "I know that now," she said. "How far am I?" "Half a day's ride if you leave at first light and know the way." He looked at her again. "You do not know the way." "I did not know the way here either," she said, and there was enough dry humor in it that he almost smiled, though he caught it before it fully arrived. "You can sleep in the barn," he said. "It is warm and dry. I will have my man Ernesto bring supper out." "I would rather eat at a table if there is one," she said. Not rudely, just directly, the way a woman who had been 4 days alone in the high desert spoke when she was past the polite pretenses. "And I can pay for the meal. I have money." He considered her for a moment. He had dark brown eyes that were steady and unhurried in the way of men who spent their lives reading country rather than people, though she suspected he was reading her just as carefully as he would have read a stretch of trail. He had dark hair that was a little long at the collar and the kind of weathered jaw that came from years of outdoor work, and he was handsome in the blunt, unpretentious way that the West seemed to specialize in, where a man's looks were simply the byproduct of the life he lived rather than anything he had cultivated. "You do not need to pay," he said. "Come inside." The house was small but clean. A main room with a fireplace and a table, a kitchen behind it, 2 doors that she assumed led to sleeping quarters, a shelf of books along one wall which surprised her, a pair of muddy work boots by the door, neatly placed side by side, which also surprised her. On the table was a half-drunk cup of coffee and a copy of a surveying journal that had been left open face down to mark a page, and a folded piece of paper that looked like a letter he had been reading before he went out to do his evening chores. He moved the letter and the journal to the shelf without comment and gestured for her to sit. "I am Stephen Collier," he said. "Hazel Archer," she said. "I am sorry to impose." "You are not imposing." He said it as though it were simply a fact, the way he would have said the creek runs south or the horses need feeding, and she found something unexpectedly steadying about that. Not warm, exactly, not yet, but solid, like the man himself. He heated a meal on the iron stove, salt pork and beans and cornbread, simple food that she ate with an appetite that embarrassed her. He ate across from her without much ceremony, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was comfortable in a way she had not expected. The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, the wind had picked up, as it did every evening in October when the cold came down off the mountains, and she could hear it moving along the walls of the house with a sound like whispering. "What is in Larkspur?" he asked eventually. She had been looking at the fire, turning the question she had been living with for 3 weeks over in her mind the way you turned a stone in your hand, feeling its weight and its edges. She brought her eyes back to his. "My brother died there," she said. "I am going to collect his things and find out what happened to him." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, exactly, but a careful attentiveness, the kind that meant he was listening properly. "I am sorry," he said. His name was Thomas. He was working a cattle drive for a man named Horace Dunmore. She watched his face when she said the name, the way she had learned to watch for any reaction that might tell her something, and she caught it, just the faintest tension at the corners of his eyes, a tightening that came and went so quickly she might have imagined it except that she had not. "You know that name," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dunmore runs cattle in this country. He is a man with a long reach and short patience. He has had trouble with men who work for him before." "What kind of trouble?" "The kind that does not get reported to any sheriff," he said, and his voice was level, but there was something underneath it that she could hear if she listened carefully. Something careful and controlled the way you would speak about something that had come close to you once and left a mark. She wanted to ask more, but something in his stillness told her this was not the moment. He had told her what he was willing to tell her for now, and she had learned in 24 years that pushing men like Stephen Collier before they were ready to speak was as useful as pushing a stone wall. "I will find out," she said instead. "You might want to be careful how you go about finding out," he said. "Larkspur is Dunmore's town." She looked at him steadily across the table. "Whose town was this valley before you came to it?" He looked at her for a moment as though she had surprised him, and then something in his face changed, something that was not quite a smile but was the interior shift that preceded one. "Fair point," he said. After supper he showed her to a small room off the kitchen that had a cot and a blanket and a washstand with a ceramic basin. It was clearly a room that had served various purposes over the years, storage and sleeping, and whatever else the ranch had required. But it was clean and warm, and the blanket was thick wool, and she was asleep before she had finished the thought that she would lie awake worrying about Thomas. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of men's voices outside, the low working conversation of ranch hands beginning a day's labor, and for a moment, in the suspended space between sleep and full waking, she could have been anywhere. She could have been a child at her parents' farm in Missouri, listening to her father and Thomas talking over the morning tasks. The grief hit her again the way it always did in those first waking moments, like cold water, and she lay still and let it move through her, and then she got up. Stephen was in the kitchen when she came through, pouring coffee from a heavy black pot into 2 cups. He had already been out, she could tell from the dried mud on his boots and the fact that his jacket was damp at the shoulders. He handed her the coffee without asking how she took it, and she drank it black and strong, and it was the best thing she had tasted in days. "Ernesto knows the road to Larkspur," he said. "He can ride with you as far as the pass, show you the turn you missed." She looked at him over the rim of the cup. "You do not have to do that. Ernesto is my foreman," he said. "He will have the time this morning. He paused, seemed to choose his next words carefully. The road into Larkspur from the East Pass goes by the Dunmore grazing land. His men patrol it. A woman riding alone might draw the wrong kind of attention. She understood what he was not quite saying directly. She appreciated that he was not wrapping it in excessive warning or telling her not to go, because he seemed like a man who understood that telling a woman like her not to go somewhere was about as effective as telling the creek not to run. "Tell me about Horace Dunmore," she said. He sat down across from her and held his coffee in both hands and looked at the table for a moment in the way of a man organizing his thoughts. Then he told her. Horace Dunmore had come to the Larkspur country in 1868, 6 years ago, and had built himself a cattle empire through a combination of hard work, sharp dealing, and a particular talent for making men who were inclined to oppose him decide that opposing him was not worth the cost. He owned the largest spread in the county, 3,000 acres of good grass country watered by 2 creeks. He owned a portion of the general store in Larkspur and had significant influence over the man who served as county sheriff, a weak-willed fellow named Pratt who had been sheriff for 4 years without ever once inconveniencing Horace Dunmore. His cattle operation depended heavily on transient labor, men hired for drives who came and went, and who, if they met with misfortune, would not generally be missed by anyone powerful enough to make an inquiry. Stephen said this without particular heat, just stating it the way you would state geography, but she could hear the weight of it. "He had trouble with one of my hands last year," Stephen said. "A man named Daniel Firth who had worked for Dunmore before he came to me. Firth told me things." He stopped. "What things?" "That Dunmore's drives ran cattle across land that was not strictly his to graze across, including land that belongs to the Jicarilla Apache who have used this country since before any of us arrived. When his men pushed cattle across that land and the Apache protested, Dunmore called it an incident and the sheriff called it self-defense." He looked at her directly now. "Firth said there was a man on the drive last summer who asked questions about the land rights, wanted to know who actually held the deeds. He got into an argument with one of Dunmore's senior hands." "Thomas asked questions about things he felt were wrong," Hazel said quietly. "That was exactly the kind of man he was." They sat with that for a moment. "I need to get to Larkspur," she said. "I know." He stood, took the cups to the wash basin. "I will ride with you." She had not expected that. She looked at his back as he stood at the basin, the set of his shoulders, the way he stood with the particular contained stillness of a man who had made a decision and was done deliberating about it. "You do not need to do that," she said, and even as she said it she knew it was a different kind of protest than the first one. The first one had been polite refusal. This one was something smaller and less certain. "I know Dunmore's land," he said, "and I know Larkspur, and if you go in there alone asking questions about a man who died on Dunmore's drive, you will get nowhere." He turned from the basin and looked at her. "I can help you get somewhere." She held his gaze for a moment and felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite trust, not yet, but was the first tender, tentative suggestion of both. "Why would you do that?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, just long enough that she knew he was thinking about whether to say the full thing or only part of it. Then he said, "Because Daniel Firth was my friend and Dunmore's men beat him badly enough that he left the territory rather than risk another encounter, and I have been looking for a reason to go to Larkspur and say something about it for a year. Your reason is better than mine, but together we might actually be heard." She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. He had a gray horse named Soldier that he had raised from a colt, and that moved with the brisk, confident stride of an animal that trusted the man on its back completely. They rode out of Coldwater Valley in the early morning with Ernesto, a compact, weathered man of about 45 with a white scar across his left forearm, and an absolute economy of speech that she found restful. And Ernesto showed them both the turn she had missed, and then left them at the junction with a touch to the brim of his hat, and rode back toward the ranch. The road to Larkspur was a good road. wide enough for a wagon, graded smooth in places and rutted in others, running through open mesa country where the sage grew knee-high, and the October sky was so blue above it that the whole world looked like something a painter had made up. They rode side by side where the road was wide enough, and when it narrowed one of them would fall back without discussion or ceremony and then come forward again when it widened. He did not talk much, but when he talked it was worth hearing. He knew this country the way you knew something you had studied for love rather than utility, and he told her things as they rode past them. The name of the mountain range on the eastern horizon, the reason the mesquites grew thicker along the dry wash bed even when there was no surface water, the way the light changed at this time of year, and how that meant the dry season was shifting. She found herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, which was more often than she would have admitted. There was something in the way he sat a horse, easy and upright without being rigid, the way his hands held the reins with the lightest possible contact, a kind of quiet authority that came from years of doing a physical thing with great skill and perfect ease. Thomas had sat a horse that way. The memory arrived without warning and her throat tightened, and she looked away at the sage flats and breathed through it. "Tell me about him," Stephen said. She glanced at him quickly. He was looking ahead at the road, not at her. "Thomas," she said, and saying his name out loud in the open air felt both painful and necessary, like pressing on a bruise to confirm it was still there. He was 31. He was the most stubborn person I have ever known, and I include myself in that comparison. He was tall and he had a laugh that you could hear from the next room. He spent 6 years working cattle drives all over this territory, and he sent money home every time he could, and he wrote me letters that were very long and very detailed because he knew I worried when he did not write. She paused. The horse Biscuit moved along steadily beneath her, and the wind came off the mesa and smelled of dust and dry grass and the faint cold edge of the mountains. He was the kind of man who could not pass an injustice without saying something about it, she said, even when saying something was dangerous. He believed that silence made you complicit. He used to quote something our father said. He said a man who watches a wrong thing happen and says nothing is half as guilty as the man who did it. She paused again. I think that is what killed him. I think he saw something on Dunmore's drive and he said something about it, and the wrong person heard him. Stephen was quiet for a moment. The horses walked. A hawk turned high overhead in the enormous blue. Then we will find out what he saw, Stephen said, and we will make sure that someone besides Dunmore and his men knows the truth of it. She looked at his profile, the clean, angular line of jaw and brow, the steadiness in it, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for 3 weeks. They reached the outskirts of Larkspur in the early afternoon. It was a town of perhaps 300 souls, the kind of rough-built settlement that the West produced in those years like it was paying an obligation. A main street of unpainted board front buildings with a general store and a livery, and a saloon, and a narrow building with a painted sign that read sheriff, and a smaller one that said post office, with a permanent look of being about to fall over. The street was dusty in the October wind, and there were horses at the livery rail and 2 men talking outside the general store who stopped talking when Hazel and Stephen rode in, and watched them with the particular calculating attention of a town that was used to belonging to one man. The post office was at the far end of the main street. A thin woman with gray-streaked hair and a capable face presided behind the counter, and when Hazel stated her business and her name, the woman's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something warmer and more cautious at the same time. "Thomas Archer's sister," the woman said. She had a low, careful voice. "I am glad someone came. I was not sure anyone would." She glanced at Stephen, who was standing slightly behind Hazel's right shoulder in the way of a man who had positioned himself as a presence without being obtrusive. "His things are in the back room. There is not much." There was not much. A bedroll, a change of clothes, a tin cup and a folded knife, and a small leather pouch with $11.40 in it, and a journal. Hazel held the journal for a long moment without opening it. It was a small thing, bound in dark brown leather, worn at the corners in a way that spoke of years of use. She had given it to Thomas herself 3 years ago for his birthday. She had found it at a dry goods store in Santa Fe and had thought he would like it because he had always kept notes, even when he was a boy, making little observations about the world in the margins of whatever paper was available. "May I?" Stephen said quietly, and she understood he was asking if she wanted a moment alone. She shook her head. She needed to look at it, and she needed to do it now, while she was still running on the kind of forward momentum that kept grief from becoming paralysis. She opened it. Thomas's handwriting filled it in the dense, close hand he had always used, his letters small and precise, the habit of a man who did not want to waste paper. The last entries were dated in August of 1874, 2 months ago. She read them standing at the post office counter with Stephen standing quietly beside her, and the thin woman giving them whatever privacy she could by busying herself with sorting mail at the far end of the room. Thomas had written about the drive, about the cattle and the terrain and the men he was working with, the ordinary minutiae of a working cattle drive that she found almost unbearable to read because it was so unmistakably him, his specific observant voice so present on the page that he might have been standing in the room reading it aloud. Then the entries changed. He had seen something. The details were careful, the way Thomas always was when he was writing about something important, organized and precise. He had seen Dunmore's senior hand, a man called Archer, drive a herd of cattle through a stretch of land along the eastern ridge that was being used by a family of Jiccarilla Apache, driving them off the camp with horses, destroying a wickiup. When Thomas had protested, Archer had told him this was not his concern. Thomas had said it was everyone's concern. Archer had told him that men who made this kind of concern their own business had a tendency to develop serious problems with their health. Thomas had written it down anyway. He had written it down, and he had written below it in the careful way of a man leaving a record. "If anything happens to me, this entry is my account of what I witnessed. I am writing it in the hope that it reaches someone who will use it." Hazel's throat closed entirely. She held the journal against her chest for a moment with both hands, and looked at the ceiling of the small post office and thought about her brother sitting by a fire somewhere in the dark of an August night, writing those words, knowing in the particular way that thoughtful people sometimes knew things that he was writing toward the end of something. "May I see?" Stephen said. She gave him the journal, opened to those pages, and watched his face while he read. He read carefully, without rushing, and when he was done he looked up at her with those steady brown eyes and said, "This is enough. This is exactly the kind of account that a territorial judge would take seriously." "Dunmore owns the sheriff," she said. "The sheriff does not cover the territory," he said. "There is a circuit judge who comes through Taos every 4 months. He is due in 6 weeks. And there is a land commissioner in Santa Fe who has been looking for exactly this kind of documented evidence about Dunmore's land practices. You know a great deal about this." "I told you that I have been waiting for a reason," he said. They spent 2 days in Larkspur. The thin woman at the post office, whose name was Mrs. Corwin, and who had clearly formed a private opinion about Horace Dunmore that she was now willing to share quietly with people she assessed as trustworthy, told them that Thomas had not been the first man to die in unusual circumstances while working for Dunmore. She gave them 2 other names. She gave them the name of a man, a Mexican rancher named Gutierrez, who had lost grazing land to Dunmore 2 years ago through what she described as the shadiest piece of legal work this county has ever seen, who would likely be willing to sign a sworn statement. They found Gutierrez on the 3rd morning, a small, weathered man in his 60s who lived on what was left of his land with his daughter and 2 grandsons. He was not immediately forthcoming. He had learned, the way many men in his position had learned, that speaking out against powerful men was something that cost you more than it gained you. He looked at Hazel with a long, careful assessment, and then he looked at Stephen, and something passed between the two men that she could see but not quite read, the specific communication of two people who understood the same landscape and the same risks. Then he looked at the journal. She had brought it. She had brought it, and she had told him about Thomas, about who Thomas had been, and she watched Gutierrez read the pages she indicated with a gravity that told her he was a man who understood the weight of written words. He signed a statement. He wrote it himself in a careful, formal Spanish, and then translated it into English and signed both versions. His daughter, a dark-eyed woman in her 30s named Rosa, signed as a witness without being asked, just stepped forward and signed her name with a steadiness that made Hazel want to take her hand. Stephen found the second witness, a former Dunmore hand named Calloway who was working at the Larkspur livery and who had clearly been waiting for something without knowing what it was. He talked for 2 hours while Stephen wrote everything down in the careful, organized way of a man who had clearly done some legal correspondence before, and what Calloway described filled in the gaps in Thomas's journal in ways that made the picture clear and damning. Thomas Archer had died of a fall from a horse in circumstances that Acker's account made sound like a simple accident, and that Calloway's account made sound like the result of a horse that had been deliberately spooked by a rifle shot fired very close to its ear. The horse had bolted, Thomas had fallen, and the fall had been onto rocky ground. It was not provable in the absolute sense, but it was enough for a judge to open an inquiry, and an inquiry was what Hazel wanted. An inquiry that would put Dunmore's name and his practices in front of a court that did not belong to him, that would create a record, that would make it harder for the next Thomas Archer to be quietly erased. On the evening of the second day, she and Stephen sat on the step of the boarding house where they had taken separate rooms and watched the sun go down behind the western mesa in a long blaze of orange and red that turned the dust in the street to gold. She held the journal in her lap, both hands flat on the cover. He would have done this himself, she said. He was trying to get to Santa Fe. He was going to take what he had written to the land commissioner. He did not make it. He left the record, Stephen said. You are finishing what he started. She looked at him. The last of the sun was on his face, warm light on the plains of it, and she was struck again by that quality in him that she had noticed from the first night, that solidity, that presence, that sense of a man who had put roots down deep into the particular soil of his life and would not be moved by anything short of an earthquake. Why did you help me? She said. You owed me nothing. I rode into your valley by accident. You could have pointed me toward the road and sent me on my way. He looked at the street. The town was settling into its evening quiet, horses drowsing at the rail, a lamp coming on in the window of the general store. He was quiet for a moment, and she had come to understand in 2 days that his silences were not absence, they were consideration, a man who did not speak until he had the honest version of what he wanted to say ready. When you rode down into the valley, he said, and I saw you come down that trail in the last of the light, I thought you were the most determined thing I had seen in a long time. You were tired, and your horse was tired, and your map was wrong, and you had been 4 days alone in the high desert, and you rode down that trail like it was exactly where you meant to be. He paused. I did not want to send you on your way. The evening wind moved between them. Somewhere in the direction of the saloon a piano was playing, thin and cheerful and slightly off-key. Stephen, she said, and saying his name felt like testing the weight of something. Hazel, he said, and something in the way he said it, the way his voice handled it with a care that was almost reverence, made her breath catch in her throat. She did not say anything else, and neither did he, not that night. But something had been established between them, quietly and without ceremony, the way the most real things were often established, without announcement, just settling into place like land after a long rain. They rode out of Larkspur the next morning with the signed statements and Thomas's journal, and they rode not toward Santa Fe but back toward Coldwater Valley, because Stephen had proposed to send the documents ahead with a rider he trusted, and because the circuit judge route through Taos made Coldwater Valley the logical stopping point, and because neither of them was yet ready to name the other reason, which was that neither of them was ready to separate. The ride back was different from the ride out. 2 days of shared purpose had created a familiarity between them that the earlier caution had not allowed. She found herself telling him things, not just about Thomas but about herself, about the life she had been building in Santa Fe, working as a seamstress and occasionally as a reader for a wealthy older woman who had failing eyesight and a large appetite for novels, about the way she had always thought of the West as temporary, a place she was passing through on the way to somewhere more settled, and how she was no longer entirely certain she believed that anymore. He listened the way he always listened, with his full attention without hurrying her. When she stopped to turn a thought over, he waited without filling the silence unnecessarily. "What made you stay here?" she asked. "In this valley specifically." "I saw it in spring," he said. "The first time I rode through this country I came through the valley in April and the creek was running full and the cottonwoods were leafing out and the light was a particular kind of light you only get in this country at that time of year." He paused. "I thought, this is the right place. I did not have a better reason than that." "Is that enough of a reason?" "It has been enough," he said. "The land does not ask you why you came. It only asks whether you are willing to stay." She thought about that for a long time as they rode. The mesa country opened around them in the afternoon light, the enormous sky pressing down with its weight of blue, the sage silver green on either side of the road, and she thought about staying and leaving and the particular difference between a place you were passing through and a place that was making room for you. They arrived at Coldwater Valley at dusk, coming down the familiar switchback trail with the valley opening below them in the failing light, the creek catching the last of the sun, the horses in the corral moving toward the fence as they heard soldiers' hoofbeats. The smoke from the chimney of the ranch house was rising straight up in the still air, which meant Ernesto had already been in and built up the evening fire, and the sight of it, the particular domestic warmth of that smoke, hit her in a way she had not braced for. It looked like home. It looked like what home was supposed to look like when you came in from a long ride in the dark. She helped with the horses because it was the right thing to do, and because she was not the kind of person who stood aside while work was being done, and Stephen let her do it without protest, which she appreciated. They unsaddled and brushed and watered the horses side by side in the comfortable silence of two people who had spent enough time together that silence was no longer uncomfortable, and the barn smelled of hay and horses and the particular dry warmth of a well-kept animal space. "Stay," he said. He said it while he was running a brush down Soldier's flank, not looking at her. Just said it, low and quiet and direct, the way he said everything. She stopped brushing Biscuit and looked at him over Biscuit's back. "I have not asked anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I am saying it before you ask, or before you do not ask and just leave because you think you ought to." She looked at him for a long moment at the set of his shoulders, the careful way he was keeping his eyes on the horse, giving her room, not pressing. The lantern swung slightly from the hook above them, sending slow arcs of warm light across the hay and the horses and the particular face of this particular man. "I am not ready to leave," she said honestly. He looked up then. Something in his face opened, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical relief she had seen on men's faces when they got the answer they wanted. Just a quiet opening like a door. "Good," he said simply. She stayed. The days that followed were some of the most ordinary and most vivid of her life. Ordinary in the way that working days were ordinary, full of tasks with their beginnings and ends. Vivid in the specific way of days when something new was growing in you, and you were aware of every moment as it happened. She helped with the ranch work because she was not a woman who sat idle, and because she found that she was good at things she had not known she could do. That riding out to check fence line in the autumn morning was a thing she had capacity for. That reading an animal's condition was something she had an instinct for that she had never had occasion to discover. Stephen watched her find these things out about herself with an expression she gradually came to recognize as a particular kind of satisfied attention, the look of a man who sees a person becoming more fully themselves and finds it quietly extraordinary. They talked. In the evenings after supper, sitting on opposite sides of the fireplace, they talked in the way of two people discovering the enormous strange coincidence of another person's inner life. He had grown up in Missouri too, in a different part of it but close enough that certain references landed with the warmth of shared geography. He had come west at 21 with two other men, both of whom had turned back after the first winter. He had not turned back. "What kept you?" she asked. "Stubbornness," he said without pretense, and she laughed. "Thomas used to say that stubbornness was the only crop the West reliably produced," she said, and then stopped because it still did that. The references to Thomas would arrive without warning and close her throat. "Tell me something else about him," Stephen said gently. "Something ordinary." "What did he eat for breakfast when you were children?" She blinked. "What? Tell me something ordinary about him. Not just how he died or what he stood for, just something ordinary." She thought about it. "He used to pour his coffee into his porridge," she said slowly. "My mother hated it. She said it was the worst combination of two good things she had ever seen. He said it was the best thing he had ever eaten, and he ate it every morning for 15 years. Stephen smiled. It was the first full smile she had seen from him. Not the almost smiles or the edge of smiles that passed across his face sometimes, but a real one, warm and generous and transforming, and it hit her so directly that she had to look down at her hands in her lap. The days kept passing, and the feeling between them grew, and neither of them named it, the way you did not name a plant you were watching come up through the ground, because naming it might somehow interfere with the growing. But they found themselves moving closer together in all the small ways, reaching for the same thing at the same time, finishing sentences for each other, standing a little closer than strictly necessary when looking at the same thing, the particular magnetism of proximity becoming more insistent with every day. 3 weeks after she had first ridden down into the valley, a letter arrived from Santa Fe. Stephen's contact there, a lawyer named Whitfield who had connections to the Territorial Land Office, had received the documents and the statements and the journal. He had written to say that the case against Dunmore had been formally filed with the Land Commissioner's office and that the circuit judge had been notified. There would be a hearing in Taos in the spring. Whitfield would represent the complaint. The Apache land issue had been referred to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was not a guarantee of justice, but was at minimum an acknowledgement that an injustice had occurred. It was not everything. It was not resurrection, and it was not a hanging, and it was not the complete and final satisfaction of a debt that could not truly be repaid. But it was a record. It was her brother's name in a document that would exist, that would be filed and kept, that said he had been a man who saw a wrong thing and said something about it and paid for it, and that the wrong thing had been seen and named. She sat with the letter for a long time in the main room of the ranch house, while the October light moved across the floor in slow golden bars, and when Stephen came in from the afternoon work and saw her sitting there, he came and sat across from her without a word and waited. "It is going to the judge," she said. "I know," he said. "Whitfield is good. It is not enough." "No," he said honestly, "it is not enough. It is what is possible." She looked up at him. "Thomas would have said that possible was the starting point. Your brother was a wise man. He was the stubbornest person I ever knew," she said, and this time when the grief came it was warmer, less like cold water and more like the ache of a healing thing. She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a moment, and then brought them down and looked at Stephen with wet eyes and said, "I do not know what I would have done if I had ridden into someone else's valley." He looked at her with those steady dark eyes and said, in a voice so quiet it was barely above the sound of the fire, "You would have managed. You are the most capable person I have ever known in this country." "That is not what I meant," she said. "I know," he said. "I know what you meant." A moment passed. The fire spoke. The wind outside moved along the walls with its familiar whisper. "Hazel," he said, and the way he said her name was not the same as the first time. It was deeper, more serious, weighted with everything that had accumulated in the weeks between. "Yes," she said, "I want to ask you something." "Then ask it." He leaned forward in his chair and put his elbows on his knees and looked at her with the directness she had come to expect from him and love about him, the lack of any pretense or performance, just a man being as honest as he knew how to be. "I want you to stay here," he said. "Not as a guest passing through. I want you to stay here because this is where you belong, and I think you know that as well as I do. I want you to stay here because the last 4 weeks have been the first time in 3 years that this ranch has felt like a home. Instead of just a piece of land, I am trying to keep alive. I want you to stay here because I have fallen in love with you, Hazel Archer, and I am not a man who says that word lightly or before he means it, and I mean it completely." She looked at him. The firelight moved over his face, the earnest, careful face of a man saying the truest thing he knew, and she thought about the wrong turn and the washed-out pass and the bad map and the valley that had opened below her in the last of the light. And she thought about Thomas writing in his journal in the dark of an August night, leaving a record for someone to find. And she thought about the way Coldwater Valley looked from the top of the switchback trail in the evening, the smoke going straight up from the chimney, the creek catching the light. "I fell in love with you the night you told me to tell you something ordinary about Thomas," she said. Not before then, but that exactly was the moment. He stood up, and she stood up, and they came together in the middle of the room with the firelight warming everything around them. And when he put his arms around her and she put her face against his chest, she felt something she had not been certain she would ever feel again, the particular peace of being in the right place, of having arrived somewhere that was both destination and beginning. He held her for a long moment, his chin resting on top of her head, her hands gripping the front of his shirt. "I was so afraid you were going to say you had to go back to Santa Fe," he said into her hair. "I have to go back to Santa Fe," she said, and felt him go very still, "to collect my things." He exhaled, a long, slow breath that she felt through his chest, and then she felt him laugh, a low, quiet laugh that moved through both of them. "You could have said that differently," he said. "I wanted to see what you would do," she said. "That is cruel." "No, that is honest." He pulled back just far enough to look at her face, and she looked up at him. And the look that passed between them was the look of two people at the beginning of something very long and very full, a look that held all the seasons still ahead and all the ordinary, extraordinary work of building a life in common. He kissed her, and it was not tentative and it was not hurried. It was the kiss of two people who had done enough careful approaching and were finally, completely, arriving. The winter came to Coldwater Valley early that year, the first snow falling in November and settling into the rocky upper ridges like a permanent decision. Hazel had been back from Santa Fe for 2 weeks by the time the snow came, back with her trunk and her sewing kit, and the 3 books she owned, and the particular determination of a woman who has chosen a direction and intends to walk it all the way. Stephen had ridden up to meet her at the top of the switchback trail on her return, which she had not expected, and which had made her eyes fill up in a way she found embarrassing, and which he seemed to find very far from embarrassing. The way he looked at her when she blinked hard and lifted her chin and said, "You did not have to come up," was the look of a man who knew exactly what he had done and was not sorry for it at all. They were married in December, in Larkspur of all places, because it was the nearest town with a minister, a small round man named Reverend Hall who had been in the territory for 20 years and had the look of a man who had seen everything at least twice and retained the capacity to be moved by it all the same. Mrs. Corwin from the post office came, because they had thought to invite her, and because she had clearly been waiting to be invited. Ernesto came, standing straight and serious in a coat that had been brushed clean for the occasion, and Ernesto's wife, A small, bright woman named Lupe who cried through the whole ceremony in the cheerful, uninhibited way of a woman who considered it an honor to cry at a proper wedding. Outside the small church, the winter sun was brilliant on the cold white street, and inside Hazel stood in her best dress, which was the blue wool one that she had made herself in Santa Fe, and Stephen stood in a white shirt she had not seen before, clean-shaved and slightly stiff in the collar, and looking at her with an expression so unguarded and completely open that she nearly laughed from the sheer joy of seeing it. She said her vows clearly and without faltering. He said his clearly and without faltering, and when Reverend Hall said he could kiss his bride, he cupped her face in both hands and kissed her with a gentleness that made Mrs. Corwin press her handkerchief to her mouth and made Lupe begin to cry harder in the most affectionate possible way. They rode back to Coldwater Valley through the winter afternoon, the land white and still around them, the creek still running dark between its ice-fringed banks, and when they came down the switchback trail, the valley received them with its particular held quiet, the smoke from the chimney rising straight and white into the pale December sky. The first full year they were married was the hardest and the richest year of both their lives. The winter was brutal in the way that New Mexico winters sometimes were, and there were cattle lost to cold and wolves, and one terrible week of ice that crusted the grass and kept the animals from grazing. And there were days when the work was relentless and exhausting, and when she fell asleep at the table after supper more than once, and he carried her to bed with a care that she would have protested if she had been awake. But there were also the long evenings by the fire when the wind outside was everything, and the warmth inside was everything else. And there were mornings when the snow on the mesa was new, and the world looked like the most astonishingly original thing. And there were the small discoveries of living closely with another person, the things you learned about someone only through the continuous, intimate proximity of sharing a life. And all of these things she found to be gifts she had not known she was receiving until she had them. In March, the letter came from Whitfield. The hearing in Taos had taken place. The circuit judge, a man named Aldridge who had the reputation of being entirely beyond Dunmore's reach, had reviewed the evidence and issued findings that included a formal reprimand against Dunmore's operation, a requirement that the grazing practices along the Apache land be immediately discontinued, and an order that the land claims of Gutierrez and two other Mexican ranchers who had come forward during the proceedings be reviewed by the land office. Horace Dunmore had not been charged with anything in connection with Thomas's death, because provable was not the same as probable, and provable was the legal standard, and Calloway's account, for all its weight, was not provable in the strict sense. But Dunmore's name was in the record now, in the formal record of a territorial court, attached to documented practices that the judge had described as inconsistent with the law and incompatible with the rights of legitimate landholders and indigenous inhabitants of this territory. It would follow him. The sheriff, Pratt, had resigned his office at the end of the proceedings in a move that Mrs. Corwin described in a letter she wrote to Hazel as the most expected surprise this county has ever produced. A new sheriff had been appointed by the county commissioner, a man from Las Vegas named Ortiz who had a reputation for being difficult to buy. It was not everything. It was not the full weight of the scale made right. But it was light in a place that had been dark, and Hazel stood in the doorway of her own house reading Whitfield's letter with the spring wind coming up the valley and the cottonwoods beginning to go pale green at the tips of their branches, and she thought about Thomas sitting by a fire in August, writing in his journal, hoping the record would reach someone who would use it. She had used it. She had used it as well as she could. She walked inside and put the letter on the table where Stephen would see it when he came in from the morning work. And she stood at the kitchen stove making coffee and thought about her brother's long laugh and his coffee-flavored porridge, and the way he had believed that silence made you complicit. And she thought that wherever he was, he would probably consider the outcome a reasonable start. She was 6 weeks along by then, though she did not know it with certainty yet, only suspected it with a knowledge that was more bodily than rational. She found out for certain in April, when the valley was in its full spring extravagance, the creek running high and bright, and the cottonwoods leafed out in that particular new green that she had come to understand, was what Stephen had meant when he said there was a light in this country in April that you could not find anywhere else. She told him in the evening, after supper, sitting across the fire from him the way they always sat, and she told him directly because that was how she told him everything, and the way his face changed was something she would remember for the rest of her life. Not dramatic, not performative, just that same quiet opening she had first seen in the barn the night he said stay, expanded now to fill his whole face, his whole bearing, the particular luminous solemnity of a man receiving something he had wanted without quite knowing how fully he had wanted it. He came across the room and knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands in both of his and looked up at her with wet eyes that she had never seen from him before, this careful private man, and said, "Are you well? Are you frightened? What do you need?" "I am very well," she said. "I am not frightened. I need nothing except what I already have." He turned her hands over and pressed his face against her palms for a moment, and then he looked up at her again and said, "I wish Thomas could have known." Her eyes filled. "He would have been impossible about it," she said. "He would have written letters full of advice and opinions, and he would have arrived in person the moment the baby was born and been absolutely insufferable with pride." "I would have liked to see that," Stephen said. "You would have liked him," she said. "He would have liked you too, eventually, after he finished interrogating you about your intentions and your land holdings and your character." "I have good intentions," he said. "The land holdings are adequate. I hope the character passes inspection." "It passes," she said. "It more than passes." He stayed where he was, kneeling on the floor of their home with her hands in his, and the fire behind him made his shadow long on the wall, and outside the valley was settling into its evening quiet, and she thought that the world was very large and mostly indifferent and occasionally extraordinarily kind, and that she was in one of those extraordinary pockets of kindness right now, and she intended to pay full attention. The summer of 1875 was long and hot, as summers in the New Mexico territory tended to be, and Hazel worked the ranch through most of it with the same energy and commitment she had brought from the beginning, though she also sat more, which she did not advertise, and Stephen noticed everything without commenting on most of it, which was the kind of attentive restraint she had come to recognize as one of his most profound qualities as a human being. They made improvements to the house that summer, adding a second room and a covered porch along the south face that caught the afternoon light, and where Hazel took to sitting in the early evenings with her sewing and her books, looking out at the valley in the way she had come to think of as her particular luxury. This view, this ordinary, extraordinary valley with its creek and its cottonwoods and its red rock walls catching the day's last light. Ernesto and Lupe were constant presences, Lupe having appointed herself a sort of benevolent domestic force in Hazel's life that Hazel accepted with genuine gratitude, because Lupe knew things that she did not know about this country and this climate and the specific practical management of a life in it, and she shared them with the generosity of a woman who had been sharing her knowledge with people who needed it for 40 years and had no intention of stopping. It was Lupe who told her, during those summer months, about what the valley had been like before Eduardo Reyes had sold it, about the Jicarilla Apache who had traveled through it seasonally for generations before the ranchers came, about the particular history of this land that was beautiful and complicated and layered with more stories than she could hold in one sitting. Hazel listened carefully and asked questions, and thought about the injustices that the West was full of, the ones that had touched her own life through Thomas, the ones that continued, and the ones that had been partially addressed, and the ones that were still waiting for their address. She thought about the hearing in Taos and the Apache land issue that had been referred to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and she thought about whether referred would turn into acted upon, and she thought that it probably would not on its own, that these things required people to continue pressing them. She wrote a letter to Whitfield in Santa Fe asking whether there was any further way to advocate for the land rights claim. He wrote back with information she spent a long evening discussing with Stephen, and between them they agreed to add their names to a formal petition that Whitfield was organizing and to donate a modest sum to a fund that was being used to hire a legal advocate specifically for the land rights case. It was not much, but it was something. Their son was born in November, at the beginning of the month, with the first real cold of the season coming through and the fire burning high in the hearth and Lupe presiding over everything with the unruffled competence of a woman who had attended 17 births in this territory and had never lost a mother and did not intend to start. Stephen was outside the door, which was where Lupe had put him, and Hazel could hear him out there, his boot steps on the porch boards, back and forth, the walking of a man who needs to be doing something and has nothing to do. The baby arrived in the small hours, red-faced and assertive and loud, and Lupe placed him in Hazel's arms with a smile that used her whole face, and Hazel looked down at this new small person and felt the specific overwhelming love that she had been told about and had not been able to fully conceptualize until this moment when it arrived in the complete and total way that it did. "Bring him in," she said. Stephen came through the door and crossed the room and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, and the expression on his face was not anything she had a word for exactly. It was too large for any word she owned. It was everything he was, all that quietness and depth and capacity for feeling that he kept so carefully held, suddenly right at the surface, no distance between it and the world at all. "Hello," he said to the baby, very softly. "Hello." The baby looked at nothing in particular with the dark, unfocused gaze of a brand new person, entirely unimpressed by anything yet. "He looks like you," Hazel said. "He looks like everyone," Stephen said. "He is 2 hours old." "He looks like you," she said firmly. He looked up at her and smiled, that full, warm smile she had first seen when she told him about the coffee and the porridge, and she smiled back at him, the two of them holding this moment like a lantern. They named him Thomas. Thomas William Collier, William for Stephen's father, Thomas for the man who had started all of this, who had ridden out on a cattle drive in the summer of 1874 and written the truth down in a small leather journal and left it for his sister to find. Winter settled on the valley and they lived their life in it. The years built themselves one on top of another in the way of good years, slowly and with substance. The ranch grew, not extravagantly but steadily, the kind of growth that came from consistent work and careful management, and a piece of land that was fundamentally generous with the people who treated it with respect. Ernesto stayed, and 2 other hands joined the operation permanently, men who were decent and hardworking and who were paid fairly and who stayed because the Coldwater Ranch was the kind of place that earned loyalty rather than demanding it. Thomas grew the way children in that country grew, fast and physical and into the land from the beginning, knowing the names of everything by the time he was 3 and riding by the time he was 4 with a confidence on horseback that made his father laugh and his mother refuse to watch. He had Stephen's eyes and Hazel's stubbornness and the laugh, the long carrying laugh that could be heard from the next room, that had belonged to his uncle, and which arrived in him with the particular surprise of an inheritance you had not known was coming. They told Thomas about his uncle when he was old enough to understand, about the journal and the hearing, and what his uncle had believed. He listened with the focused attention of a child receiving something important, and then he asked if he could see the journal, and Hazel got it from the cedar chest where she kept it and put it in his hands, and he turned the pages with extreme care and looked at the writing he could not yet fully read and was very quiet for a moment. "He was brave," he said finally. "He was," Hazel said. "Like you," he said. She pressed her mouth to the top of his head and held it there for a moment and thought about Thomas, about all the ways he had come through the years and was still present, still influencing the shape of things. The hearing's outcomes continued to develop slowly and imperfectly in the way of institutional things, and Horace Dunmore's operation was reduced considerably over the following years, partly by the legal and administrative pressure that the hearing had initiated, and partly by the simple fact that his methods, now documented and on record, made men less willing to work for him and made creditors more cautious about his prospects. He never faced criminal charges for Thomas's death, and this remained a wrong that was not made right, not in the legal sense. But the Apache land issue resulted in a formal agreement in 1877 that established seasonal use rights along the eastern ridge, a modest and insufficient but real acknowledgement that had been made possible in part by the evidence that had originated in Thomas Archer's careful August journal entries. Whitfield wrote to tell them about it, and Hazel read the letter sitting on the south porch in the autumn light with Thomas on her lap asking to hear what it said, and she read it to him plainly and simply, and when she finished he said, "So your brother helped even after he was gone?" And she said yes, that was exactly right. She and Stephen had 2 more children in the years that followed. A daughter they named Clara arrived in 1877, fair-haired like some distant ancestor neither of them could account for, and possessed of an absolute certainty about the world that was entirely her own. A second son, James, arrived in 1880, quieter than both his siblings, a child who observed everything with careful dark eyes, and who from the beginning had his father's quality of attention, that full, unhurried listening that was one of the most generous things you could give another person. The family that grew up in Coldwater Valley was the kind of family that the frontier occasionally produced when the conditions were right. 3 children who knew the land they lived on and were known by it, who understood that home was something you built and tended and could not take for granted, who grew up understanding that the world was large and complicated, and that the decent thing and the easy thing were rarely the same thing, and that the decent thing was worth choosing even when it cost you. Hazel's days were full in ways she had not imagined when she was a 24-year-old woman boarding with a widow in Santa Fe, certain that the West was temporary, and that somewhere more settled was where she was eventually headed. She sewed and she read, and she managed the household accounts with a precision that quietly terrified the Larkspur Bank, and she wrote letters to Whitfield in Santa Fe about ongoing land rights matters, to Rosa Gutierrez, whose father had died in 1876 with his land restored and his dignity intact, to Mrs. Corwin, who continued to run the Larkspur post office with the quiet authority of a woman who knew everything that happened, because everything came through her hands first. She wrote letters to Thomas too, sometimes in her journal, because she had started keeping a journal of her own not long after arriving at Coldwater Valley, the habit of it growing naturally out of living in a place where things happened that deserved to be remembered. The letters to Thomas were not separate from the journal, just woven into it, a conversation that she intended to continue for as long as she lived. She told him about the children, about the ranch, about the way the light came through the valley in April in that particular way that Stephen had described when they were first getting to know each other, that light that you could not find anywhere else. She told him about the porch and the cottonwoods and the creek, and about Ernesto teaching Thomas Jr. to rope a fence post when he was 5, and about Clara's utter imperviousness to the cold that had the rest of the family baffled every winter, and about James's habit of drawing maps on any available surface including, twice, the kitchen wall. She told him that Coldwater Valley was the right place. She told him she had not been heading here, but that here was where she had arrived, and that she understood now that arriving somewhere was sometimes the best argument for having been heading there all along. Stephen found her on the south porch one October evening in 1882, 8 years after she had first ridden down the switchback trail into the valley on a tired horse with a wrong map and a stone of grief in her chest. He came and sat beside her in the other chair, the one that was his, and they sat together in the last of the afternoon light looking out at the valley the way they always did in the evenings when the work was done and the children were inside and the land settled around them with its particular held quiet. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She considered it. The creek was catching the light, silver bright in the October gold. The cottonwoods were turning, going yellow at the edges, the way they did this time of year. The red rock walls of the valley held the warmth of the day the way they always did, giving it back slowly as the evening came on. The smoke from the chimney was going straight up. "The day I rode in," she said. "The first evening, you came out from behind the barn with your lantern. I thought you were lost," he said. "I was completely lost," she said. "Not entirely," he said, and the quiet amusement in it was warm and familiar, the voice of a man who had been the person you could hear from inside the house when the wind was too loud outside, who had been the light in the window, who had said stay before she had thought to ask. She reached over and took his hand, and he turned his palm up and held hers, the way he had been holding her hand for 8 years, easy and complete. "I am glad I had the wrong map," she said. He lifted her hand and pressed his mouth to the back of it, and his lips were warm against her skin, and the valley was golden and still around them. And somewhere inside the house Thomas Jr. was teaching Clara something. She could hear his voice raised with patient repetition and her daughter's raised in cheerful argument. And James was probably drawing on something he should not be drawing on, and would show it to her tomorrow with absolute confidence in the quality of the result. The October wind came off the mesa and moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like a long, slow exhale, and the mountains on the eastern horizon were going blue-gray in the failing light, and the creek ran on and on below them, bright and cold, and reliable as everything she had come to count on in this life, in this valley, with this man who had come out of a barn with a lantern on an October evening in 1874, and changed the entire direction of everything she had ever thought she was heading toward. She thought about Thomas's journal, sitting in the cedar chest inside, and about Gutierrez signing his name with a steady hand, and about Rosa witnessing it without being asked, and about Mrs. Corwin at the post office counter saying, "I am glad someone came," and about Ernesto pointing her toward the road and then Stephen saying he would ride with her instead, and about a circuit judge in Taos looking at a carefully written record and deciding it merited his full attention, and about all the small acts of conscience and courage that had accumulated to create the partial and imperfect justice that was all that was usually possible in this world. She thought about how love worked the same way, not in one enormous gesture but in the accumulation of small ones, in the lantern and the canteen and the coffee and the meal and the hand held in front of a fire, and the name said carefully, and the word stay offered before it was asked for, and all the 8 years of ordinary and extraordinary days that had followed. "I love you," she said, because she said it often and she meant it every time, and Stephen Collier, who was not a man of unnecessary words, said what he always said in return, not the same words exactly but the same truth, which was, "I know, I love you back. I have loved you since that first evening when you came down the trail, and your horse was tired, and your map was wrong, and you looked like you were exactly where you meant to be." She laughed, a full, easy laugh that carried out across the valley and up toward the evening sky, and he smiled beside her, and the light went slowly and the stars came in, and Coldwater Valley held them both in its wide good dark, and the smoke from the chimney rose straight and white and the creek ran on, and everything was, at last and at least, as whole as the world allowed itself to be.